Welcome to Byju's classes. We are back again with our weekly review of international relations, which as usual is always carefully curated and crafted, keeping in mind the needs of the aspirants of the civil service examinations. The events in the past week have been most interesting. It seems that President Donald Trump, under pressure because of his falling ratings in elections, has set his country on the course of a collision with China, an emerging superpower and a main contender for primacy with the United States of America. What happened was that he closed without any notice the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas, and alleged that this consulate was being misused by the Chinese for stealing intellectual property of United States and carrying on espionage and spying activities. Interestingly, none of these had been mentioned in public domain at all, and the Chinese were given a 72 hours notice to clear out. Some excitement was generated because the Chinese started burning waste paper, and the smoke rising from the building led the firework tenders going there in a hurry. Of course, they were not allowed entry inside. Chinese, of course, acted the aggrieved party with the victims and said that they had been falsely implicated in a propaganda campaign by an American president who is trying to vilify and demonize China at every step. Now, one must keep in mind that closure of a consulate is a well-known practice in diplomacy to show your displeasure to a country who has offended you in some way or the other. Now, the interesting part is this: that the Chinese, again following a well-known diplomatic practice, retaliated by closing at short notice the American consulate in Chengdu. Now, the Chengdu consulate was in western China and was seen in America as a window to developments in Xinjiang region and Tibet. For a long time, Americans have been wanting to open a consulate in Lhasa, which the Chinese have resisted. But interestingly, neither the consulate in Houston, Texas for China nor the Chengdu consulate for Americans is the most important consulate. There are consulates in Hong Kong, there are consulates in Shanghai, Canton, so on, and the Chinese also have consulates in major American cities. So effectively, diplomatic interaction between China and United States of America at the consular level is not going to be disrupted. So in coming days, we might see the repercussions elsewhere also. There doesn't seem to be a rapprochement in sight. The tensions in relations between the United States of America and China also increased in another theater. The American warplanes have been taking flights very close to the Chinese airspace, less than 100 nautical miles or 100 kilometers, whatever way you like to put it. Now, this distance is much too short for a fighter aircraft flying at a very high speed, and a small human error can take you into the airspace where you are not supposed to be there at all, and it might be misconstrued as an act of war or hostility. So it might ignite unintended military clashes in a theater which is already very volatile. That's one part. The Chinese did not put up with this very easily. They launched a rocket ostensibly to explore Mars, but also to demonstrate their ever-increasing capacity of space technology. There also have been news items in recent past which say that both Chinese and the Russians have capacity to launch low-orbit satellites in space which can be used as weapons. They can target the satellites launched and put in orbit by other nations for communications, for mapping, for weather forecasting, and destroy them. Now, so far, the international law has treaties which safeguards space as a non-militarized zone which would be free from atomic weapons, which would be free from other kind of weapons. Nations should not create debris which might be creating risk for other nations. But this seems that we are entering a phase of a space race where it may not be possible to maintain this treaty intact. The Western countries are very worried, understandably, that Russia and China can now target their communications and weather forecasting, and of course, as satellites used for espionage on ground in hostile countries' territories, and destroy them. Now, this was followed by a series of news items which are interesting. The Russian President Putin also announced that Russia has the cutting-edge lead in weaponization. It says that it now has hypersonic missiles with unlimited range which can be launched from naval ships. It says that it also has the capacity to launch underwater submarine drones. Now, this is cause for great concern, because what has happened is that unfortunately this year marks the 75th anniversary of a very gruesome event in human history, when United States of America had dropped atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, extinguishing them, millions of people, in a blink. But what has happened is that ever since there has been a concerted effort in international community to have nuclear disarmament. Unfortunately, ever since President Trump took over, he has tried to dismantle this structure of which sought to control the arms race between the United States of America and Russia. So the START 1 treaty, which was supposed to be put in place by Obama, has all but been crippled by Trump, and also on the ostensible, very frivolous ground that China is not a party to it. It was never intended to be a party to these talks at all. President Trump also sort of discarded the arrangement about peaceful uses of nuclear energy with Iran. So there has been unfortunate heightening of tension due to unpredictability of what would happen to nuclear weapons and space technology which can be used to deliver them elsewhere in the country. Now, the big 5 countries which are in the Security Council, you keep them apart. The heightening concern about proliferation of nuclear weapons and the unpredictability of their use is greatly increased, not only because of the 5 permanent powers of the Security Council, but also states who are suspected to have an nuclear arsenal. Some not suspected, some are known, like India and Pakistan. Then you have Israel, then you have North Korea, and you suspect that Iran might acquire one soon. So one doesn't know how soon a regional conflict can flare up as a flashpoint into a nuclear conflagration. So any heightening of tension in a center or a regional conflict has implications for upsetting the international balance. Now, whether this would be reduced in coming years as President Trump is under pressure or defeat faces him, looms large in front of him, but that is neither here nor there. At the moment, Russians and the Chinese have shown their capacity of high-tech weapons, which America at the moment doesn't seem to match. As international attention has remained focused on rising tensions between the United States of America and People's Republic of China, President Putin of Russia has steadily continued to increase his influence in areas which he considers of great strategic interest to him. There is a small country called Belarus, which is adjacent to Russia. It was always considered very much a part of the Soviet Empire, and even after the Soviet Empire disintegrated, it was supposed to be very closely allied to Russia and almost its protectorate. Nobody thought that it could ever challenge the might of Russians. But recently we have been witnessing events which are interesting and ironical, to say the least. President Alexander Lukashenko has ruled Belarus uninterrupted for more than 25 years, longer than Putin has ruled Russia, and he always has ruled as a dictator with the support of the Russians. But now he is claiming, as he is looking forward to a re-election once again, that the Russians are interfering with the elections. He has ruled Belarus with a very strong hand, but he has tried to provide the basic necessities to his people, but there is a fatigue with the dictator's rule in his own country, and also the people now are aspiring to have some freedom of expression, some choice, some introduction of democracy. Now, he has not allowed any opponent to come anywhere close to challenging him. In these elections, the person who was trying to come closest to it, a very famous blogger called Sergei, was imprisoned, and his wife Svetlana has been trying to put up a strong resistance to the president of Belarus. He has banned rallies. In the middle of July, in the capital Minsk, some 15,000 people had assembled, which was a very large number for a country which had been ruled undemocratically for so long, defying the presidential fiat and diktat. Water cannons were used against them, and the president threatened that he would not hesitate to use bullets if need be to maintain the integrity of his country and also to preserve the ideology which he practices. But by the end of the month, the resistance had snowballed to a level where the protest movement brought out close to 70,000 people on the streets and roads of Minsk. So things are definitely not going well for the president. Now, some people suspect that to remain in power, he might postpone elections, he might try to interfere with elections, rig them, whatever it is. But once he does that, any of these things, his hold on power would be weakened. And the worst thing that is weakening him is his trying to confront President Putin as a person who's interfering in his country's elections and political processes. Now, there are two ways of analyzing this relationship. There are some people who think that this is a very diabolical scheme of Putin. In past, what he has done is he has offered President Alexander an opportunity to join Russia, become an integral part of it, become its province, and he has very generously offered to be the president of Belarus and Russia together. This, of course, is unacceptable to President Alexander. But then some people believe that Putin now, in a very devious way, is allowing the Belarus president to act as a safety valve, and whatever resistance, opposition is there would be let loose. And after that, when he is eased out of power or is ousted, it would be far more amenable to Russian pressure. So that's one interesting diabolical explanation of what is happening in Belarus. But the other might be that the autocrat, the dictator who has ruled unchallenged for 25 years is just refusing to let go. But how long can this continue when the winds of change have already touched Eastern Europe is for us to consider. Now, interestingly, it is not that the most of the Eastern Europe is really in favor of democracy, because they have never really tasted the kind of Western democracy which the European nations have or which the America tries to promote. They probably still have residual strong sympathy to their socialist way of economic organization, to certain security which that ideology provided to them, and there is an issue also of national pride. So as long as you make an appeal to nationalism, the autocratic rulers from Turkey to America to China to a certain extent to India, everywhere they have been reinforcing their hold on power. So this might very well happen in Belarus as well. We have seen this happen in the elections in Hungary, we have seen this happen in recent elections in Poland, and Bulgaria, etc. are no exception. So Belarus again is allowing us to think in terms of Putin's strategy in Eastern Europe, and he has more or less turned his face from the Pacific theater where China is given a free rein, and he is getting more and more involved in Europe. There also is some negotiations when he says that the Turkish president and Putin can talk to each other and try to settle something which is happening in the Middle East. So his activism, aggression towards Ukraine in an annexation of Crimea are part of a large grand design which is to restore erstwhile Soviet empire to the territory of the present-day Russia. One of the most sensational bits of news in the last week was the conviction of the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, on charges of multi-billion-dollar scam, which can carry a punishment of over 7 years if it is not overturned by a court of appeal. Now, the interesting part is this. The former Prime Minister Razak is the son and a nephew of former Prime Ministers of Malaysia. He belongs to an aristocratic ruling elite family of the country, and nobody expected him to be involved in such a scam. But interestingly, it is not as if you are born to power, you have a sense of entitlement, you can resist temptations of this kind. In this case, there are very many other dimensions which are worth considering. It almost led the ruling coalition in Malaysia to disintegrate. Razak led UMNO, the United Malay National Organization, which represents the Malays, who have been sharing power with Chinese through MCA, Malaysian Chinese Association, and the MIC, Malaysian Indian Congress. But these parties, these coalitions which had worked very well in past, had been upset ever since the fire-breathing, pro-Islamic custodian of the rights of the sons of the soil Malays, Mahathir, challenged it in late 1960s. And Mahathir continues to lead a different party, forcing UMNO to face a great challenge, and he is almost 92 years old. But in the past couple of years, he doggedly pursued this allegation of corruption against Razak. He was made to resign, but things are still unstable because the relationship between Dr. Mahathir, who was forced to resign as a Prime Minister, pro-tem Prime Minister, his aides like Anwar Ibrahim, has never been very easy, and he is very old. So what is going to happen in Malaysia if these charges stick and the former Prime Minister goes to jail is one part. Interesting part is this: there are dimensions in this case which trace the funds to Saudi Arabia. In nutshell, the allegations are very simple, that close to US dollars 4.5 billion were put in an account of Razak. And of course, Razak says that this was done without his knowledge. People he trusted, his financial advisor, his accountants, are parties to this scam, and they are missing as fugitives at the moment. Now, whether we will ever be able to trace the roots of this is different, but the interesting is that however rich you are, if somebody puts billions of US dollars in your account and you are just not aware of it, is stretching credulity a little bit. Now, even more disturbing is that almost 1 billion US dollars out of this is supposed to be a personal gift by the Saudi royal family to the Malaysian former Prime Minister. Now, this is what is most disturbing, because this says that foreign money has been brought in to a political ruler to influence policy. Now, influence peddling through buying off top leaders is not only common in small countries. We have seen this kind of news leading to the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, major leaders of Conservative Labour Party. We have seen this kind of influence peddling and donations to political parties done by China in Australia. But in this case, it is so blatant that it is simply difficult to overlook. Now, where the Saudi connection becomes important is that Malaysia by itself is not a very large country. It is not a very large producer of oil. It just produces enough to be prosperous. It has been exporter of rubber and tin and palm oil in the context of India. India has had a slightly strained relationship with Malaysia in recent past because of its sheltering Dr. Zakir Naik, an evangelical missionary who has been allegedly responsible for recruiting people for Islamic terrorism in India. But the point is, Malaysia is a very interesting country where besides peninsular Malaysia, two of its states, Sarawak and Sabah, are on the northern tip of the island of Borneo. Now, northern tip of island of Borneo faces the South China Sea. So the Chinese advance in South China Sea is directly impinging on the territorial waters of Malaysia because of states of Sabah and Sarawak and the Islamic Sultanate of Brunei. Now, again, almost after a gap of 6 decades and more, the dispute about Sabah, the northernmost state of Malaysia, has again arisen. This was a disputed territory between Philippines and Malaysia when the Federation of Malaysia was being formed between 61 and 63. But the problem is it had been almost forgotten. Philippines had conceded that Malaysia has the right to develop Sabah, but it had never formally given up its claim. Now, President Duterte of Philippines, who's a Roman Catholic, is worried about the Islamic insurgency in the south of Philippines in the Mindanao region, and where the Sultanate of Solo was the original owner of all of Borneo, including the northern tip, Sabah, Sarawak, and the Sultanate of Brunei, which was established after he ceased to be powerful there. The rest of the Borneo, Kalimantan Utara, is owned by Indonesia, which again is a country with the largest concentration of Muslim population in the world. Now, keep this in mind, and you suddenly see how volatile this politics becomes, because Duterte has won an arbitration award about the island it claims as its own in South China Sea. China refuses to accept the arbitration award, but Duterte has always been walking a very tight rope and saying that ultimately we can't face China, we can't confront China, we can't fight China, so we should amicably, diplomatically settle this dispute. Difficult to imagine how this can be done, because Philippines has been always very closely allied to the United States of America. People jocularly made fun of it as the 51st state of United States of America, a child of Hollywood and Roman Catholic Church. But all these things are marginal at the moment. The very real threat is that the China has got Philippines slightly away from its traditional ally, United States of America. This policy of President Duterte has not been very popular in Philippines. There have been anti-Chinese protests. So far they have not gotten out of hand. But the clash between the Filipinos of the Malay origin, Filipinos which are parties to they have memories of the ancient past of the Malay Greater Malayu Raya Malay Empire. They are at one step very happy to claim the state of Sabah in North Borneo as a territory owned by the Sultan of Holo. But Sultan of Holo in Mindanao region was basically a sultan who, like most Malay sultans of this area, was living off piracy. So you cannot possibly at the moment, and the Islamic terrorist group Abu Sayyaf is active in this region, and people suspect that the Islamization and the dogmatic interpretation of Islam in Malaysia, also the injection of this virus in Indonesia, has been fueled by petrodollars coming from Saudi Arabia. So this Saudi fund transfer of billions of dollars to the former Prime Minister's account has implications of spread of Islam, proliferation of Islam, and if China can project itself as a defender, at least partially, of interest and integrity of countries threatened by Islam, it might add one more dimension to its expansionist policies in South China Sea. Much to the disappointment of Indians, the long-awaited de-escalation, disengagement in the South Asian subcontinent has failed to materialize. The Chinese withdrew from the points where they had incursed, but they refused to yield any ground in the Pangong Lake area. There is no longer an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation in the Galwan Valley, but the build-up of the military hardware, whether it is fighter planes or it is armored vehicles or it is long-range guns, continues. So both sides refuse to blink. They seem to indicate a little willingness to keep on the talks, but the credibility of China has been badly lost. And what is causing more concern in India is that the Chinese activities in India's immediate neighborhood continue in a fashion which can only be called hostile. This is seen in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, perceived to be a great time-tested loyal friend of India, has administered not one but 4 snubs to the Indian High Commissioner there in recent past. This lady, the Indian High Commissioner, sought an appointment 4 times. It was refused, including one when she was about to leave Dhaka. And now it has also been announced by the Ministry of External Affairs that this lady is going to take over as Secretary East. So Bangladesh will continue to be part of her very, very vital charge. So I think the damage done by the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens has caused so much misunderstanding between India and Bangladesh, allowing China some space to increase its influence. In the same time when we are getting these news items of the Bangladeshi snubs to Indian High Commission, it was not only these diplomatic signs of displeasure. They refused to even issue a token thanks of appreciation about the aid rendered by India for the flood relief in Bangladesh, which is very unusual. Now, Bangladesh is reeling under a very bad flood situation. India probably can be in a position to provide more relief at the same time. But India again seems to be so distracted with China in Ladakh Valley and in the northern sector that it is not giving enough attention to immediate neighborhood. Similar is the situation in Nepal. Now, we have always held in the Nepalese internal politics is the business of Nepalese. How they settle their power struggles is their concern. Whether they remain democratic or secular or republican or become again a Hindu Rashtra or a kingdom is their constitutional or unconstitutional monarchy is their concern. But what we have been witnessing is a period of instability which can only be detrimental to India's security and strategic interest. The tug of war between KP Sharma Oli and Prachanda continues. The meeting of the standing committee was announced repeatedly, postponed repeatedly. It has become some kind of a farce. After it was postponed and cancelled for the 9th time at the last minute, Prachanda's patience gave way and he did hold a meeting in the Prime Minister's Balwatar official residence. Now, interestingly, what has happened is that in the past we have been getting news that a compromise was on the anvil, worked out by the Chinese ambassador in Kathmandu. But the interesting part is this, that then it was said that the power sharing of some kind might be possible. And the speculation was that there were close to 30 members of the committee in favor of Prachanda and only 15 or less with Mr. Oli. But when this meeting took place, it seems that the number of people willing to stake everything in favor of Prachanda was less than 30. They were close to 24, 25. So it seems that the situation of flux will continue, but Unfortunately, as long as this instability continues in Nepalese politics, the country would not be unable to meet with the coronavirus threat, it would be unable to meet with the threat of the economic downturn, and as long as the ill will against India becomes the only rallying point, the only ultra-nationalist thing in Nepal, and there have been small pinpricks from the researches in Ramayan to border pillar posts being put up in the no man's land. I mean, these are provocative activities on the part of Nepal. Now, without being patriotic, one might suggest that no man's land is just that. So neither side should try to claim it, barb it, restrict it. It acts as a buffer. So in the Pithoragarh, Champawat districts, the Tanakpur region, this no man's land, the Nepalese officials and some volunteers and the villagers have come. First they set up wooden pillars, then they had concrete pillars, then a barbed wire was run through this. So far the Indian side has exercised great patience, but any local incident like it happened on the Bihar border some time back can take place anytime. So we have to be patient, but there are limits to the compromise you can make with strategically important locations when you know that a hostile larger neighbor is active against your interest in this third country which has traditionally been your friend, be it Nepal, be it Bangladesh. The Chinese have also raised the ante and put pressure. They have brought out another segment of disputed border with Bhutan. So this engages Bhutan in dialogue with China, keeps it slightly away from India, or raises the risk for China to, again like a Doklam-like situation, come out in favor of Bhutan and stretch itself even more. So this Chinese activity on the military front and on the diplomatic front, be it in South China Sea, be it in South Asian subcontinent, and it keeps talking about Pakistan and the One Belt, One Road and the China-Pakistan economic corridor and so on, which is thinly disguised way of encircling India. Well and good. Last week, the world encountered lots of active diplomatic activity focusing on events likely to follow after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Americans and the Taliban signed an agreement which had a lot of birth pangs, so to speak. There were glitches. Talibans were very reluctant to keep up their part of the promises, and they wanted Americans to withdraw totally, leaving the country in their control, which the Americans understandably were reluctant. But these glitches were ironed out over the past weeks, and now it seems to be very clear that the Americans will withdraw and Talibans will agree to a power sharing arrangement with the present government in Kabul, at least for the time being. The Chinese on their part have been very apprehensive about this American move. There was a time when they thought the Americans in Afghanistan were protecting them against Islamic terrorism in Uyghur provinces, Xinjiang, etc. But right now, with the trade war with America being fought with bitterness, the Chinese are not so sanguine about their partnership with the US in this part of the world. They are also worried that the Taliban ultimately are creatures of CIA and Pakistan, and while the Americans can try to manipulate the good Talibans against the bad Taliban, as they say, as they define them, and retain some kind of a control with them because they have experience of dealing with Taliban leaders, and Pakistan has been, of course, a party with the Americans to raising this crop of Islamic dogmatic people. So when they end up in Afghanistan, they are more likely to have channels of communication open with the United States of America and Pakistan. That was what was China's major worry. And these worries have been a little increased ever since the American aid official Khalidi Nizad has been making these statements that billions of dollars would be made available for the reconstruction, infrastructural development in Afghanistan. And he's been making slightly provocative noises were targeted indirectly at China by saying that this kind of aid is free from strings, while aid coming from some other sources might be leading the country into a debt trap. There are also very interesting developments. The Americans have once again revived the idea of a TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan and India. This was originally mentioned in the context of a pipeline, but now the Americans say that they would be very happy to build a railroad following this TAPI, which ultimately, when future turns rosy for both India and Pakistan, would connect India directly with Turkmenistan. As far as China is concerned, this would seem to fit in perfectly with its One Belt, One Road program, but not at the moment if the Americans are partners and sponsors in this. Turkmenistan is, after all, one of the major suppliers of gas for China. China buys 30%, close to 30% of its all gas requirements from this country, and it would be very reluctant to have a deal which sort of jeopardizes its relationship with these countries. It has Pakistan very much under control, but the Americans are not going to let go of Pakistan so easily. If China has cultivated Pakistan for past 60 years, the Americans have done it for even a longer period. And Pakistan also realizes that it cannot do without maintaining a very delicate balance between its patron, United States of America, and its present ally, the People's Republic of China. The Americans have again, through World Bank, made an offer that they would build a railroad from Karachi to Peshawar to beyond to Turam in Afghanistan, which would sort of be a parallel competitive infrastructure development program with what the Chinese have been offering to Pakistan. But the Pakistan continues to receive billions of dollars of aid from America, and it cannot look down on it. At the same time, it cannot afford to antagonize China. The Chinese have been trying to put pressure on Pakistan, but Pakistan is trying to take advantage of both sides to see whether it can contain. Now, the Chinese also realize that if the Americans prop up Pakistan, this all will be cutting India down to size and restricting it to within its borders. But what this means, in short, is that the scope for India to make a presence in Afghanistan is shrinking constantly, and maybe it is not a very bad thing, because the Americans were trying to encourage India to make massive investments in Afghanistan, which the Chinese at the moment are a bit reluctant to do. They know what happened to the Americans, they know what happened to the Soviets before that, and of course they remember history long time, what happens to the British before that. So they are going to let others contain the crisis in Afghanistan while they can cash in on it. But the net result is the Indians should think twice in a far-sighted manner, not be moved by emotional historic ties with Kabul or Afghanistan, stories of Kabuliwala, Indian diaspora in Afghanistan, but think strictly in terms of national interest, strategic and economic, as things operate in South Asia today. One of the most interesting news items last week related to the congressional hearings about big technological businesses in America, and these hearings took a fairly hostile form. Congressional investigation of the increasing power and monopoly of these big tech companies like Amazon, like Google, like Apple, like Facebook had been continuing for almost a year. But this time all the four CEOs were hauled up together. There was a virtual grilling. They raised their hands, took an oath, and testified under oath to the congressional committee. And it began on a pretty aggressive note. One of the congresspersons said that our forefathers, the founding fathers of this republic, had refused to bow their head before a monarch, the British monarch, and we refused to bow our head before a merchant prince or a corporate monopolist. So the American Congress summoned the CEOs of four largest tech companies in America, which are threatening to become too big for their boots, too powerful. They were Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Tim Cook of Apple, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and Sundar Pichai of Google. All these people were sort of on a defensive. They kept saying that, look, what we have been doing is strictly according to the American values. We believe in the free market, we believe in competition, we work hard, we try to increase our profit, and we have flourished. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. But at the same time, what was happening is, except Tim Cook of Apple, everybody else was not in a position to defend some of the indefensible activities. The Congressional Committee was armed with secret mails, their public statements, and the complaints against them by their competitions, and all of them were accused of political partisanship, not being entirely free about the freedom of expression, trying to destroy competition by either buying competition or by sort of threatening them, or also abusing their monopoly by developers of programs and so on and so forth. Now, the person who was targeted most was Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, not without reason, because he's been very partisan in American politics, and ultimately he has also been forced under a judicial order from the Supreme Supreme Court in Brazil to take away some very pro-President Bolsonaro accounts which were spreading fake news in the favor of President. But they did it under protest. They said that this was against the laws of freedom of expression of Brazil itself. They said they were being asked to restrict their activities beyond the jurisdiction of the Brazilian sovereign government. But at the moment, they said that we worry about the safety and security of our employees in Brazil, and so they grudgingly, under protest, made a compromise. But mighty Mark Zuckerberg had to retreat a little from his position. He's always been defending that the freedom of expression is one of the fundamental values of American life, and this is why he should not be criticized for allowing a diversity of opinion to flourish on his platform. That's the Facebook. But the Facebook's partisanship in favor of Donald Trump and the conservative white supremacists has repeatedly come under protest. But he is slowly having to yield ground. Now the interesting part is this: whether it is Apple, whether it is Amazon, whether it is Google, these companies have really become so big that the Americans broke down a big monopoly in telephone domain, the AT&T Bell company, and very many small baby bells were formed at that stage. Some people compared it with the kind of power which was exercised by Rockefeller at one time, who was called the classic robber baron, that his Stanway Petrol Company was more rich, more powerful than any other company in the United States of America. But people say that this comparison is not fair. While Rockefeller's companies had massive economic power, monopoly in the oil industry, they did not have such political power either in America or in international politics elsewhere. So it has been said that the companies like Facebook can influence even American elections. There have been accusations of their being interfering with politics. Say they might support a democratic group, freedom of expression group in Hong Kong and elsewhere, which again is a problem. And these American companies may have become much too big even now today for the American Congress to take action which is substantial and meaningful against them. So everything is waiting and watching for the American presidential election and what would happen. And these companies, incidentally, have profited billions of dollars. The monthly sales of Apple and Google and Amazon are above $100 million a month. These companies have profited in the times of coronavirus crisis where the economy is on a downward trend. So I think the already monopolistic power of these companies cannot be compared with the 19th century, early 20th century robber barons, and this high tech is what international relations depends on, whether it is computers, whether it is space technology, whether it is marketing, whether it is doorstep deliveries. So the arguments on both sides are almost evenly balanced, and also is interesting because if you say from rags to riches story, a poor Indian immigrant coming and becoming the CEO of one of the largest companies in America, or somebody is starting from scratch, a school dropout, all these things are quite all right in their own place. But the IT sector, the information technology, is so secretive, so they can't even share the patents or accesses or their processes with the rest of the world. They may say that the nation's security depends on them. So in one way, even the American government, however well qualified it is to investigate and curb and restrict them. And then we should never forget that at the moment the American public opinion is divided almost evenly between the conservatives and the liberals, and the court is packed with judges which are not exactly forward-looking or very technologically oriented. Time to turn our gaze towards the continent of Africa. And interesting things have been taking place in southern tip of this continent, which unfortunately continues to be called the dark continent. The first news that caught our attention was from South Africa, where the government, after decades-long resistance to getting a loan from the World Bank, ultimately was constrained to literally beg for a loan to bail it out of the coronavirus crisis it was going through. And a loan of billions of dollars at a very concessional rate of interest, 1.1% was granted to it in principle, and this is close to some $4.1 billion in US dollar terms. Now, interesting thing is this, that South Africa is reckoned to be a developed nation. not even a middle-income nation, but an industrialized nation, a high-income country. But the disparities, inequality in the country are so stark that it goes through a very large, gigantic amount of corruption, and there is violence, and all this money which the country is supposedly earning is going down waste. President Zuma was, of course, eased out of his position because of his unprecedented scale of corruption. But even after that, the present president tries his best, and he says he supports the finance minister, who is very frugal, he is very prudent. But let's wait and watch, because there are two interesting things here which we cannot overlook. A, the existing debt burden of South Africa is controlled by 30% of it is controlled by foreign investors. So if they want to put a crunch, South African economy is in trouble. The second trouble spot can be the rand. At the moment, the rand, the national currency, is reasonably strong. But if because of economic downturn, because of coronavirus, and because of the trouble the government has been constrained to ask this loan from IMF, the rand falls, the loan taken in foreign exchange terms and its servicing is going to become a major problem and might lead to more social unrest and political instability. There is no guarantee that the African National Congress, the party, can control its entrenched vested interest to result in a leakage in the state budget, in the government expenditure, although there are no conditionality attached to this World Bank loan at the moment. But it's worth watching how prudently the South African government can use this loan. Will it really go to provide relief for the coronavirus stricken people? Will it go towards building up the infrastructure for healthcare? Or if this again, large amount of it at least, will go down the drain? It will be tragic if this happens. The second interesting thing which we were witnessing was in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, when Mugabe was ousted from power after a 40-year rule as an autocratic dictator, there was hope that there would be change there now. And President Mnangagwa, who had succeeded him, was supposed to be this hope, but within 3 years these hopes have dissipated. There are allegations of corruption, there are allegations of wastage of money, scarce resources on expensive SUVs and luxury cars, Land Rovers and Jaguars for high government officials and diplomats. And while people are suffering because of coronavirus, they are suffering from food shortages, and there is misgovernance all over the place. So obviously there are protests, and Zimbabwe government has issued strict orders that the protesters will be dealt with very strictly. And what is more interesting is that the ruling party, the ZANU-PF, not the government, has issued an ultimatum to the American ambassador calling him a thug, that he should be expelled if he doesn't stop subverting the Zimbabwe state and the duly elected state with funds supplied to the opponents of the president and the ruling party. They have also come out to make provocative statements to the people at large by saying that don't give us an SOS call. Don't wait for us to come and protect you. Whenever you see a protester on the street, see them as enemies of your nation, your own enemies who are going to hurt you, hurt your property. So you must, whatever comes to your hand, you must protect yourself. This is almost an open invitation to vigilantism. So things may turn down from bad to worse in Zimbabwe very soon. And the third country in the same southern part of the African continent, which was in news, was Mozambique. Now Mozambique, again, there was a time when it was in news for Cuban mercenaries fighting there, for its Marxist inclination, but it seems that the Americans have at long last decided to take on the deep pockets of the Chinese and their investment in this region, either to buy corrupt leaders or to gain popularity with the people or arouse hopes about American support in economic development. So they have promised a $4.5 billion aid program to develop infrastructure in Mozambique. So this seems to be a full circle coming in, where a country which was ruled by a socialist clique was being eyed by China, and China has had massive investment infrastructure, supposedly in infrastructure in Tanzania and elsewhere, where the allegations are that it is trying to buy corrupt leaders, but the same strategy seems to be being followed by the Americans in this part of Africa. The other part of Africa, which again simmered and might explode any moment, was the northwestern tip, where once again the Libyan civil war seems to be taking a turn for the worse, and people are preparing for another clash of arms between the rebel Haftar and UN-recognized government in Tripoli. This is all we have for you this week in our review of international relations. We will be back again next week with another edition of this review curated for you, analyzing events which are of significance. We hope you enjoyed watching this episode and found it useful. Till next week, thank you and goodbye.